Okay, social work at the turn of the century and in the early 20th century became more the kinds of benevolent societies and volunteer work that women were doing was becoming professionalized. So women were actually professional social workers. And what is very outstanding about Janie Porter Barrett is that she actually, inspired by the settlement house movement in Chicago, brought that to Hampton. So she's an outstanding example of the ways this is the Locust Street settlement house here.
Locust Street is a street in Hampton.
Yeah, the ways in which national movements or finding their way into smaller cities like Hampton in the South, not in a large urban area like Chicago. And the realization that disadvantaged people could be uplifted is appropriately a very African American concept at any rate. If there's anything that you should know about African American history, it's African Americans are very good at self-improvement and uplift. It also says something that here is a woman with significant influence, not just in Hampton, a mover and a shaker, but also statewide. She organized I don't know the exact women.
State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs.
Colored Women's Clubs. There was already one for white women, and actually two prominent women here in Hampton, Molly Gordon Darling and Mrs. Schmelz. Is it Henry Lane Schmelz?
Mrs. Henry Lane Schmelz.
She was
both white,
prominent white women here in Hampton who were members of the white women's clubs. Were on the board of her statewide organization. The women's club movement wasn't about women getting together and playing bridge every week. In Virginia, the women's club movement was very important in the early 20th century as a way for women to network, to create solidarity in their social movements, the movement's social improvement programs that they were involved in. And I think it had certainly a component of interracial cooperation between white and black women. And in fact, in the 1950s, the Hampton Women's Club created an interracial cooperation committee and invited a prominent African American woman to come and talk. I just want to say one thing. I know that Ruth has a lot to say. I just want to say one more thing. You can see that by this time, African American women who in the colonial period had been subjected to harsh slave codes, after emancipation, during Reconstruction and beyond, were beginning in their own communities to become civic activists. And actually, what we're finding out more and more is they were cooperating with women civic activists too. We don't know the extent of this, but some other historians have written about this, for example, in North Carolina. So here we have actually African American women catching up or beginning to have rights and a status and a civic standing.
And many of them being recognized in a similar status or something of the same with the elite white women of town. Of course, African Americans as a group are poorer than whites. That was much more true in the progressive era than it is now. And black children often were the great losers. Janie Porter Barrett founded a school up in Hanover County, which is now called the Barrett Learning Correctional Center, for young women, mostly black, who needed this kind of structure in their lives, whose homes had dissolved or in some other way they needed the help of the state and of social workers like Barrett to help them get back on track. We also, right here in Hampton, although the building is gone now, it's out on West Queen Street, 2 graduates of Hampton Institute as it was then, Anna Woodson and her husband, the Reverend W.B. Weaver, founded the Weaver Orphanage, which they and their children carried on for 60 years for black kids here in Hampton and Elizabeth City County. They reared generations of black children. And in fact, people like Molly Darling gave a lot of money to support their efforts. So we have both blacks uplifting themselves and their children, and the beginnings during the Progressive era, largely from people from like Molly Darling, who was born in Connecticut, but nevertheless lived here in Hampton, and Mrs. Schmelz was certainly born here in Hampton. She's a Hickman from Fox Hill, engaged in this social uplift movement. We can see more about this on the other side.